For decades before the Second World War, many officers within the German High Command viewed the United States through a narrow and deeply flawed lens. American society, they believed, was dominated by commerce, comfort, and a civilian culture that lacked the hardness required for modern total war. The United States, in this view, was a nation of shopkeepers and businessmen, not soldiers. Industrious in peacetime perhaps, but lacking the martial tradition that the German General Staff saw as central to military excellence. This assumption would shape German intelligence assessments throughout the late 1930s and into the early years of the conflict, influencing strategic decisions at the highest levels of command. German military observers had paid attention to the American experience in World War I, but interpreted it selectively. They noted that the United States had required significant time to mobilize, that its officer corps lacked the professional training found in European armies, and that its troops arrived with equipment often supplied by the Entente. These observations were used to reinforce the belief that America could not sustain a prolonged conflict or develop a serious military threat without relying heavily on foreign partners. Even in the early 1940s, as the United States began its massive mobilization, this earlier analysis still shaped German expectations. This perception was further strengthened by a comparison between German and American pre-war forces. Germany had built a large, experienced army with a highly centralized command structure, a doctrine refined through numerous campaigns, and officers increasingly hardened by combat. The U.S. Army, by contrast, was small, dispersed, and inexperienced. German commanders saw this difference not as temporary but systemic. To them, the United States simply lacked the institutional culture needed to transform into a first-rate military power. What the German High Command underestimated, however, was the very nature of American strength. While they judged the United States through the lens of traditional European military culture, they failed to appreciate the strategic implications of a society organized around mass production, decentralized innovation, and an unparalleled industrial workforce. These qualities did not resemble old-world military tradition, and therefore the German establishment did not treat them as military assets. Yet these would become the foundation for a type of warfare that Germany was fundamentally unprepared to face. The early war years seemed to confirm German assumptions. American forces were untested, their command structure was still adapting to rapid expansion, and German successes in Europe reinforced the belief that no industrial advantage could compensate for superior doctrine and experience. But beneath these early impressions, a profound shift was underway. The United States was assembling not just an army, but a system, a logistical and industrial mechanism of unprecedented scale. By the time Germany recognized the implications of this transformation, the gap between expectation and reality had become a strategic shock from which the German war effort would never fully recover. In the months following America's entry into the war, German intelligence analysts watched U.S. industrial figures with a mixture of skepticism and disbelief. Reports flowing into Berlin spoke of production goals so vast that many within the Wehrmacht dismissed them as propaganda. The idea that the United States could outproduce the Third Reich on a scale of multiple times over did not seem plausible to officers trained to judge military power through manpower, doctrine, and battlefield experience rather than factories and assembly lines. German analysts categorized many early American production estimates as Fantasiezahlen, fantasy numbers. When the United States announced programs calling for tens of thousands of aircraft, ships, and armored vehicles per year, German intelligence circles frequently assumed these figures were political targets designed to boost morale or intimidate the Axis. They believed no industrial system could be redirected so quickly or so efficiently toward total war. The United States, in their view, lacked both the centralization and the militarized economy required for such a transformation. Yet within a short period, the reports could no longer be ignored. Liberty ships, produced in assembly line fashion, began sliding down American slipways faster than German U-boats could sink them. Factories in California, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and countless other locations completed B-24 bombers, Sherman tanks, and armored vehicles in quantities that surpassed any projections the Wehrmacht had believed feasible. By 1943, American shipyards were achieving production speeds that defied German expectations, launching vessels in weeks rather than months, and sometimes completing new hulls in record-setting days. This scale of output had strategic consequences that went far beyond numbers on paper. German planning had relied heavily on the idea that Allied shipping losses would outpace American shipbuilding. They expected U-boats to sever Atlantic supply lines faster than U.S. industry could repair the damage. Instead, German Naval Command watched in frustration as convoys grew larger, escorts became more numerous, and new vessels replaced losses almost immediately. What was designed as a war of attrition at sea turned into a losing contest of industrial capacity. German field commanders likewise began to feel the impact. Reports from the Eastern Front and North Africa mentioned increasing quantities of American equipment arriving to support Allied operations. Supply crates, trucks, aircraft, and vehicles bearing U.S. markings appeared in regions where Germany had not expected American influence to be significant. This expanding presence was not simply a matter of quantity. It represented a logistical network capable of moving massive volumes of men and material across oceans and continents. By mid-war, American industry was outproducing the Axis in key categories by ratios that had once seemed unimaginable. Aircraft production surpassed Germany's by several multiples, while the output of tanks, trucks, and ammunition reached levels that fundamentally reshaped the battlefield. German commanders, who had believed early in the war that victory would depend on tactical superiority and operational skill, now faced an opponent whose strength came from a different type of warfare, one fought through unrelenting systematized industrial pressure. The realization that the fantasy numbers were not only real but accelerating forced a profound reassessment within the German High Command. The United States had achieved something few in Berlin thought possible. It had turned its economic strength into a weapon more powerful than any single battlefield doctrine. The war Germany envisioned, a contest of maneuver, experience, and operational art, was gradually giving way to a war of production, logistics, and endurance. And in that realm, the United States held an advantage Germany could not match. When American forces first clashed with the seasoned units of the Afrika Korps at the Kasserine Pass in early 1943, many in the German High Command believed their long-held assumptions about the United States had been vindicated. The U.S. Army, still inexperienced and undergoing rapid expansion, met Erwin Rommel's veteran troops in a difficult landscape that demanded tactical cohesion and battlefield discipline. The result was a series of setbacks that German commanders interpreted as proof that the shopkeeper army could not withstand professional, battle-hardened forces. German reports from the front described American troops as brave but poorly coordinated, with command structures that struggled under pressure. Rommel himself noted the hesitations in American leadership, the uneven performance of units encountering their first major combat, and the disorganized retreat that followed the initial German thrust. American defensive positions were penetrated with relative ease, and logistical confusion added to the sense of inexperience. For German officers observing the battle, these events seemed to reinforce the belief that the United States lacked the operational depth necessary for sustained warfare. Yet beneath the surface of these early engagements lay a reality that German intelligence failed to grasp. While the battle exposed American weaknesses, it also revealed the U.S. Army's capacity for rapid adaptation. Within days, American commanders re-evaluated their structures, reorganized communication lines, and integrated lessons that other armies might have required months to absorb. German units noticed that, unlike many opponents they had faced, the Americans did not collapse or lose cohesion entirely. Instead, they withdrew in a manner that allowed for consolidation and re-evaluation, signs of a system capable of learning under fire. American material and logistics also demonstrated a resilience that surprised German observers. Even as frontline units struggled, the volume of reinforcements, equipment, and supplies arriving in North Africa continued to grow. Vehicles lost in battle were replaced quickly, and new aircraft filled the skies at a pace that German air units could not match. Where German forces often relied on stretched supply lines and limited reserves, American units had access to a supply network whose scale was only beginning to reveal itself. Within weeks of the initial defeat, the U.S. command structure underwent significant changes. Ineffective leaders were replaced, coordination with British forces improved, and tactical doctrines were rewritten to reflect the realities of desert combat. This rapid evolution reflected a broader characteristic of American military culture, the willingness to abandon ineffective methods and adopt new ones without hesitation. German intelligence, accustomed to evaluating opponents based on rigid doctrines and traditional hierarchies, underestimated how disruptive this adaptability could become. By the time the Tunisian campaign neared its end, the German High Command began to recognize that Kasserine had not been the confirmation of American weakness they initially believed. Instead, it marked the last moment when the Wehrmacht would face an American army still finding its footing. The adversary that emerged from the aftermath of Kasserine was no longer the untested force that had entered North Africa. It was a rapidly modernizing, increasingly coordinated military supported by an industrial and logistical base of unprecedented magnitude. Kasserine had offered the illusion of validation for German preconceptions, but it also signaled the beginning of a shift that would soon overturn them completely. The next encounters would show an American army transformed, one that would begin to demonstrate not only resilience, but an entirely different philosophy of warfare, one defined by overwhelming firepower, mobility, and relentless supply lines that Germany could neither match nor stop. When German commanders awoke on the morning of 6 June 1944 to the news that Allied forces had landed in Normandy, many understood immediately that this was no ordinary operation. Yet even in those first hours, the scale, coordination, and material density of the invasion exceeded anything the German High Command had anticipated. For years, German assessments had focused on the quality of their own fortifications and the perceived inexperience of American forces. What unfolded on the beaches of France challenged those assumptions in a single, overwhelming display of firepower and logistical precision. The first shock came from the sheer magnitude of the naval and aerial bombardment. German defenders reported artillery concentrations so dense that they disrupted communications, destroyed positions in minutes, and created layers of devastation that the Wehrmacht had rarely encountered on the eastern or western fronts. The volume of shells, rockets, and bombs dropped in the opening hours far exceeded the German capacity to respond. Commanders who had grown accustomed to carefully rationed ammunition and increasingly scarce fuel found themselves facing an opponent whose supply seemed virtually limitless. As the landings progressed, German field officers noted something unexpected. The Americans fought with a philosophy that emphasized overwhelming force at every level. Their infantry advanced under a rolling shield of artillery support. Their engineers cleared obstacles with abundant explosives. Their vehicles arrived in waves that suggested a depth of reserves far greater than German intelligence had predicted. The Anglo-American airborne landings, which spread confusion deep behind German lines, further demonstrated the Allies' ability to coordinate complex multi-branch operations with precision. German counterattacks, launched with the expectation of containing and driving the invaders back into the sea, quickly revealed another startling reality. Every time German armor attempted to advance, it encountered not only determined infantry, but a torrent of anti-tank fire from multiple directions. German officers reported that American and British units appeared to have an almost inexhaustible supply of artillery ammunition. Batteries that would have paused to conserve shells in German doctrine fired continuously, reshaping the battlefield hour by hour. This wasteful use of firepower, viewed by German planners as inefficient, proved devastatingly effective in breaking the cohesion of German counterattacks. Even more alarming was the logistical infrastructure unfolding behind the beaches. As German defenders attempted to regroup, they observed the rapid construction of supply depots, vehicle parks, fuel dumps, and makeshift ports. The establishment of the Mulberry harbors in particular demonstrated an engineering capacity that stunned German observers. Within days, the Americans and their allies were unloading equipment at a pace that no German supply network could hope to match. The Germans, relying on horse-drawn transport for much of their logistics, faced an adversary capable of moving mechanized units, fuel, rations, and ammunition with a speed and volume that defied traditional military expectations. The result was a growing recognition within the German High Command that they were confronting a fundamentally different type of army. The American approach was not defined by elegance of maneuver or battlefield finesse. It was defined by systems, logistical systems, industrial systems, transportation systems that allowed them to fight a sustained, high-intensity war without exhaustion. German officers who had once mocked American material Schlacht and battles of material began to understand that this was not a weakness, but the core strength of the American way of war. By the conclusion of the Normandy campaign, the German realization was complete. The United States was fighting with an abundance of firepower, mobility, and supply that rendered traditional German operational methods increasingly ineffective. D-Day had not only opened a new front, it had exposed the widening gap between a mechanized, industrialized military system and a German war machine straining under material shortages and structural limitations. The momentum that began on the beaches would soon carry forward into the next great shock Germany would face, the breakout at St. Lo. By July 1944, after weeks of fighting in the hedgerows of Normandy, German forces believed they understood the rhythm of the American advance. They had faced determined infantry attacks, heavy artillery barrages, and a growing tide of logistical support. Yet they still assumed the U.S. Army lacked the operational finesse needed to deliver a decisive breakthrough. Operation Cobra shattered that final illusion. The operation began with a concentrated aerial bombardment, unlike anything the German divisions around St. Lo had ever experienced. Thousands of American aircraft, heavy bombers, medium bombers, and fighter bombers struck a narrow section of the German line with extraordinary density. German communications collapsed almost instantly. Units were disoriented, and defensive positions ceased to function as coherent structures. The scale and precision of the bombardment demonstrated an operational integration between air and ground forces that few in the German High Command had fully appreciated. But the true shock came not from the bombardment itself, but from what followed. The American breakout force surged forward with a level of mechanization the Germans could not match. Columns of tanks, half-tracks, trucks, and supply vehicles poured through the gap, forming a torrent of movement that overwhelmed the ability of German units to regroup. German commanders, accustomed to maneuvering armies that relied heavily on horses for transport, watched as the Americans converted firepower superiority into operational speed. Reports from the front spoke of American units moving with a fluidity that seemed impossible to German staff officers trained under the rigid constraints of limited fuel and ammunition. U.S. commanders advanced rapidly because their logistical apparatus, spanning ports, depots, transport battalions, repair stations, and fuel supplies, could sustain continuous motion. American vehicles rarely paused for lack of fuel. German vehicles often remained idle for exactly that reason. The contrast between the two armies was becoming stark. One fought with the momentum of an integrated machine, the other with the diminishing remnants of an exhausted system. German field officers were particularly stunned by the American ability to reorganize and redirect large formations at speed. In the days following the breakout, U.S. armored divisions executed wide flanking maneuvers, encirclements, and rapid penetrations across the French countryside. What the Germans had dismissed as an army with limited tactical sophistication revealed itself to be a force capable of combining overwhelming material strength with effective operational planning. As American forces fanned out, German units found themselves increasingly isolated. Communications were disrupted, supply lines were severed, and defensive positions were bypassed before they could be fortified. The traditional German reliance on flexible, tactically adept soldiers no longer compensated for strategic disadvantages. Even elite German units, renowned for their discipline and battlefield skill, struggled against an opponent whose mobility and firepower negated their strengths. Operation Cobra marked the moment when the German High Command understood that the American military system operated on principles fundamentally different from their own. The U.S. Army did not rely solely on battlefield experience or tactical brilliance. It relied on an industrial and logistical engine that enabled it to project sustained high-speed force across vast distances. The German war machine, still rooted partly in 19th-century methods and constrained by severe resource shortages, could not counter an opponent that fought with such depth and consistency. In the weeks that followed, the consequences of Cobra unfolded rapidly. German forces retreated across France, unable to halt the expanding momentum of American mechanized formations. What had begun as a single breakthrough evolved into a campaign of pursuit and collapse, demonstrating that the United States had become not just a formidable opponent, but a dominant force capable of reshaping the Western Front. In the aftermath of Operation Cobra, as American forces broke through German lines and advanced across France with unprecedented speed, a new challenge emerged, one not defined by enemy action but by distance. The rapid pace of the American advance threatened to outstrip its own supply lines, a problem the German High Command assumed would eventually halt or slow the U.S. momentum. Based on their own logistical struggles and the immense strain mechanized warfare placed on transport networks, German officers believed no army could maintain such velocity for long. What followed, however, contradicted these expectations entirely. The American response to the logistical crisis was the creation of a supply system that would become legendary, the Red Ball Express. Conceived as an emergency measure and executed with extraordinary efficiency, this network of truck convoys operated around the clock to deliver fuel, ammunition, rations, and parts to frontline units racing toward the German border. Within days of its inception, the Red Ball Express became a symbol of American adaptability, a logistical machine built on improvisation, manpower, and an endless supply of vehicles. German intelligence officers, studying aerial reconnaissance photos, saw streams of trucks moving along designated routes, protected from interference by an intricate system of traffic control, maintenance stations, and pre-selected supply depots. These convoys represented the kind of logistical mass the Wehrmacht had never been able to assemble. While the German army relied heavily on horse-drawn transport, a reality often obscured by the iconic image of their armored divisions, the Americans fielded thousands of motorized vehicles capable of traversing long distances at speed. The level of coordination required to sustain the Red Ball Express was something German planners found difficult to comprehend. Each truck carried critical supplies, and each route was maintained with strict discipline to prevent delays. Drivers worked exhausting shifts, often sleeping little, navigating roads damaged by weather and war, but the system held, even when fuel shortages or mechanical failures threatened to disrupt the flow. Replacements and repairs arrived quickly. The American logistical philosophy valued redundancy. If one component failed, multiple alternatives were available to keep the system functioning. The Red Ball Express also highlighted the depth of American industrial capacity. The sheer number of trucks used, far exceeding anything the German army could field, reflected an economy capable of producing motor vehicles in quantities that dwarfed Axis output. To German analysts, the convoys were a visible demonstration that American industry did not simply support the war, it defined its tempo and shape. As the U.S. Army continued its advance, the Red Ball Express allowed American units to maintain pressure on German forces that were trying desperately to regroup. German divisions, depleted and short on fuel, found themselves outmaneuvered not merely by American armor but by the logistical system sustaining it. The Americans could move faster, supply more reliably, and recover more quickly from setbacks. German commanders, struggling with shrinking resources and bombed-out transportation networks, increasingly realized they were facing an opponent whose logistical framework functioned with machine-like consistency. By the time the Red Ball Express reached its peak, it had delivered hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies, enabling American forces to maintain operational momentum far beyond what German planners had thought possible. The system's success revealed a core truth about the American war effort, that the United States fought not just with soldiers and tanks, but with an integrated logistical architecture capable of sustaining warfare at a scale and speed that Germany could not match. The Red Ball Express became more than a supply route. It became a symbol of the American system, a system that Germany increasingly recognized as the decisive factor in determining the course of the war. And as the conflict progressed toward its final phases, this system would prove itself once more in one of the war's most critical and desperate confrontations, the Battle of the Bulge. As the Allied forces pushed eastward in the late summer and autumn of 1944, German commanders began to confront a deeper truth about their opponent, one that went far beyond battlefield performance or material production. They were no longer fighting merely an army, they were fighting a system. This American system, as some German officers later called it, represented a fundamentally different approach to warfare, one that integrated industry, logistics, organization, and technology into a unified whole. It was this system, more than any individual weapon or tactical innovation, that increasingly determined the direction of the war. At the core of the American system was an unprecedented coordination between military planning and industrial capacity. U.S. factories produced vehicles, aircraft, and ammunition in staggering quantities. But these outputs were not simply stockpiled. They flowed continuously through a logistical pipeline designed to deliver supplies where they were needed, and when they were needed. This pipeline operated with a level of efficiency that astonished German intelligence analysts who had assumed that only a centrally controlled, militarized economy could achieve such results. Instead, the American model blended civilian industry with military oversight, allowing for constant adaptation, rapid problem-solving, and flexible reallocation of resources. Another defining feature of the American system was its emphasis on standardization. From the ubiquitous 2.5-ton truck to the Sherman tank, American equipment was built with interchangeable parts and designed for ease of repair. German units, accustomed to the strengths and limitations of their own high-performance yet maintenance-heavy equipment, struggled to understand how the Americans sustained so many vehicles across such long distances. The answer lay in design philosophy. The United States favored simplicity, reliability, and quantity over specialized engineering. This approach enabled American mechanics to restore disabled vehicles with remarkable speed, keeping divisions mechanized and mobile even under intense pressure. The system extended beyond material. American military organization prioritized decentralization at the tactical level, granting junior officers and non-commissioned leaders significant authority to respond to battlefield conditions. This contrasted sharply with the rigid structure the German army was increasingly forced into by shortages, attrition, and an overtaxed command hierarchy. German officers who once admired American equipment began to realize that it was the human and organizational components, training, adaptability, communication, that made the U.S. Army's immense resources truly effective. Logistics remained the backbone of this system. American supply networks incorporated layers of redundancy, ensuring that a failure in one part of the chain did not cripple the entire effort. Railways, trucks, pipelines, depots, and ports worked in concert to deliver a constant flow of ammunition and fuel. German commanders, who often rationed ammunition for their artillery and faced chronic fuel shortages even before 1944, watched in disbelief as American forces employed firepower on a scale that seemed unsustainable. The reality was that the American system was designed specifically to make such output sustainable. Finally, the American system leveraged technology in ways that multiplied its strengths. Advances in radio communication, cryptography, engineering, and aircraft production created an environment in which American forces could coordinate vast multi-division operations with speed and reliability. German staff officers, trained in a tradition of meticulous operational planning, found themselves increasingly outpaced by an opponent whose planning cycles were faster, whose resources were deeper, and whose battlefield decisions were informed by superior communication networks. By late 1944, the German High Command had come to recognize that they were not merely being outnumbered, they were being outsystemed. The American system represented a new model of warfare, one that blended mass production with flexibility, firepower with mobility, and engineering with logistical sophistication. It was a system designed for modern industrial conflict, and it was reshaping the battlefield in ways the older European military traditions could not counter. This realization would take on even greater significance in December 1944, when Germany launched its last major offensive in the West. In the Ardennes, the Wehrmacht sought to exploit terrain, weather, and surprise to break the American lines. What they encountered instead was the culmination of everything the American system had become: resilience, adaptability, and the ability to recover from shocks with a speed no German commander believed possible. By December 1944, the German High Command faced a stark reality. Their armies were retreating on both fronts, fuel reserves were dwindling, and Allied air superiority had become overwhelming. Yet Hitler and several senior commanders believed there remained one final opportunity to reverse the course of the war, a concentrated offensive through the Ardennes that would split the Allied armies, capture Antwerp, and force a negotiated settlement. It was an audacious plan rooted in desperation, one that relied on surprise, winter weather, and the hope that the Americans would break under pressure. But it also rested on a mistaken assumption that had plagued German strategy since the war's beginning: the belief that the United States lacked the resilience and organizational depth to withstand a major shock. In the opening days of the offensive, the German plan appeared to succeed. American units along the Ardennes front were thinly spread, inexperienced, and unprepared for an attack of such scale. German armored divisions surged forward, exploiting fog and snow that grounded Allied aircraft. Communications collapsed in several sectors, and a sense of chaos took hold as American commanders struggled to determine the size and direction of the German assault. German officers, observing the confusion, believed that this was the moment when American weaknesses perceived since North Africa would finally re-emerge. Yet the American response in the days that followed revealed a characteristic that German intelligence had consistently underestimated: resilience. Despite the initial shock, units that had been scattered or pushed back began reorganizing with remarkable speed. Divisions on the flanks redirected forces to reinforce critical points, and commanders at all levels adapted to the rapidly changing situation. The most famous symbol of this resilience emerged at the town of Bastogne, where elements of the 101st Airborne Division, surrounded and cut off, refused to surrender. German officers expected panic. Instead, they found stubborn determination. As weather conditions improved, the American logistical system, so often dismissed by German planners as cumbersome or overly reliant on resources, proved its worth. Supply planes began dropping ammunition, food, and medical supplies to isolated units. Fuel and reinforcements were redirected with precision, and the U.S. Army's ability to shift entire divisions across great distances in short periods became a decisive factor. German tank units, critically dependent on captured fuel dumps that never materialized, found themselves immobilized. Vehicles abandoned for lack of fuel littered the roads, while American convoys continued to flow toward the front. The turning point came with General George S. Patton's Third Army, whose rapid maneuver stands as one of the most remarkable operational feats of the war. Patton executed a 90-degree turn of an entire army group, an action that German planners considered impossible given the conditions, and moved north toward Bastogne in a matter of days. This maneuver demonstrated the full integration of American command, logistics, and mobility. While German formations struggled to coordinate movements across icy roads and complex terrain, American units shifted direction with speed that defied traditional expectations. German commanders observed these events with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. The offensive intended to exploit American inexperience instead revealed the strengths of the American system: flexible leadership, redundant supply networks, and a capacity to recover from sudden adversity. Even elite German units, such as the Waffen-SS armored divisions leading the attack, found themselves unable to sustain momentum against an opponent that combined determination with massive logistical support. By January 1945, the offensive had collapsed. German losses in men, vehicles, and fuel were devastating and irreplaceable. The failed Ardennes gamble accelerated the decline of the Wehrmacht and marked the last moment when Germany possessed the initiative in the West. For many in the German High Command, the Battle of the Bulge solidified a realization that had been growing since Normandy. The United States could not be defeated through operational brilliance alone. Its strength lay in a system that made recovery inevitable and defeat temporary. The final German gamble had revealed not American fragility, but American endurance, and in the last months of the war, this endurance would prove decisive as Germany faced the full weight of an opponent whose power extended far beyond the battlefield. By the final months of the war, the German High Command understood a truth that had eluded them for years. They had gravely misjudged the United States. What they had once dismissed as a nation of shopkeepers had revealed itself to be a fully integrated war machine, industrial, logistical, and organizational, capable of generating and sustaining power on a scale the German military system could not match. American firepower proved overwhelming, its logistics unbreakable, and its ability to adapt under pressure uniquely decisive. In the end, Germany learned that modern war was no longer won by tradition, experience, or tactical brilliance alone. It was won by a system, one built on industry, innovation, and relentless supply. And in that domain, America was built different.